Hello. So today I'm going to talk about the next chapter of Politics UK, chapter 6, which goes into political themes and fringes. So English nationalism in the medieval times has been something that has always been prevalent, especially since the English nationalism gradually became known as British nationalism due to the integration of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and has arguably been formed by the threat of Europe in making the British identity a stronger force. For instance, Spain in the 16th century, Napoleon in the early 19th century, Germany prior to World War I, and to some extent, some argue, Brexit as a response to EU integration. However, the British have never truly felt equivalent to Europeans, and this has been something that we have seen across the political aisle, especially in the 20th century. So it wasn't until the 1950s that a need to become a part of the European economic community that came from the Conservative Party mostly, due to the UK's economy falling behind that of the European economic communities. And it wasn't until after Thatcher's premiership that the right had a firmer Euroscepticism bloc. And ironically, Thatcher was a supporter of this group, even though she was responsible for some of the strengthening of ties with the European economic community. And by the time that Tony Blair became prime minister, it was believed that he was drifting the UK away from the European Union. And this was seen through the closeness that he had with the American President George W. Bush, through his rejection of adopting the euro for the UK's currency, and this was something that the right tolerated. The glue of British identification by the early 21st century was starting to be seen as weaker than before, as many English felt that the devolutionary efforts of before did not support the English and instead gave disproportionate powers to places like Scotland. The Scottish 2014 referendum reinforced this notion of how the Scottish were different from the English, and there was even a bloc within these English groups who wanted to see two separate states. And the UK, of course, has had a dark racist history, and this has been seen especially in the notion of superiority that many Britons felt over the people from their colonies. But it has also been a haven for the Commonwealth citizens that it has taken, especially for citizens of other Commonwealths to escape bad conditions of their own countries. So by the end of the Cold War, there was a growing irritation with Eastern Europeans who were seen as coming into the UK and changing their culture, which reignited this anti-non-British nationalism, as many felt out of place in their own home cultures. Racism as a whole in the UK has been seen to be going down in comparative levels than in the past, including tolerance to racial marriages of their children to people of other races. Yet there has been continued attacks on blacks and Jews in the UK, including many black footballers experiencing racial abuse, and sometimes with the pro-Palestinian rhetoric of Jeremy Corbyn, who had generalized Israelis as a whole and thus placed many Jews to feel that they are being ostracized. There is also a prominent ecological perspective in the UK politics that rejects just the entire left-right spectrum of politics and political identity. Instead, this idea blames industrialization as the issue of all that is wrong with the country. This is something that the Greens embody on this part, not entirely, but are a great embodiment of this way of thinking, as they have called for radical points that go beyond politics, the traditional ideas of politics, including the notion that people should be satisfied with enough, and that people should rely on themselves and not agencies. This has had some wins in the Scottish Parliament, but no major wins. There have been some groups like XR Rebellion which have tried to make this critical national issue, have tried to highlight this critical national issue with civil disobedience. Now, looking into the far left politics of the UK, the Communist Party of Great Britain was a former party that gained legitimacy from the post-World War to the end of World War II era, and eventually became the Democratic Left as the Cold War unfolded. There were multiple Communist adjacent groups, though, including the Socialist Worker Parties, which has backed the Anti-Nazi League in the 1970s, and including the Anti-War Coalition against the war in Iraq. And the left has had a roller coaster effect, in which part of the left has become more prominent. It was seen that in the early teens that Jeremy Corbyn's win for the Labour Party sparked hope for a renewed far-left politics, whereas by the time Starmer came in and introduced a more moderative efforts, it was showing that otherwise. And now, whereas on the far right of British politics, there have been important figures like Oswald Mosley, who led the British Union of Fascists and tried to implement corporatism at the time to have workers deny the ability to strike, ban on political parties, rejecting imports, which would mean having everything made in the UK entirely, and he even hinted at trying to remove outsiders, mainly perceived as Jews at the time. And this is all in an effort to call for national sovereignty. Now, this is around the 1940s, but around the time when the Holocaust's horrible effects were known to the Britons, that this party and Mosley's group was losing support. The National Front was another group that's prominent, and it had a central racist message in the beginning, including that there was a conspiracy of Jews controlling the world, and they were trying to ban interracial marriages. This party later became the British National Party and worked with neo-Nazis and terrorist groups, and they were related to violent actions that had occurred. Nick Griffin later leads the party with the sensational xenophobic messages on cultural infiltration by immigrants. And by the elections of 2009, this type of rhetoric actually helped in giving the UK Independence Party wins by showing that immigration was an influential issue. And this even gave some wins for the British National Party. The English Defence League and the British Freedom Party had links were other far-right groups that also had links to violence against the left and immigrants. And another interesting part about the far-right politics is radical Islam, which has spurred from the integrated British Muslims who have come from economically deprived neighborhoods. And there's even been some radical groups that have aimed at implementing Sharia law in the United Kingdom. QAnon conspiracy theory, which originated in the United States, has also been affecting UK politics, showing how the fringe conspiracy theories are actually making political traction. And fringe ideas usually don't win quickly, as the author summarized towards the end, as people need to accept the ideas over time and circumstances must change. Some will try to do this through gradual and more moderative efforts, or others will try a more revolutionary approach, which hasn't seen much success, as we can tell. So I'll start with my first point on the feasibility of green politics in governance. The aforementioned ecological perspective is something that I think applies to virtually any country that has industrialized and where there is a group of citizens who believe there must be an end to the industrial structure of their respective country. The goals ecological preservationist political groups push for, like the Greens in the UK, which includes for humans to become self-reliant and to share and look after those in our society, are quite colossal orders than what traditional political parties have usually pushed for. I believe we should evaluate these goals alongside the other goals environmental protectionist groups push for through two lenses, and I'll start with the first lens, which looks at the practical means of accomplishing these goals. Now, let's say these principles are democratically voted for in government. Let's say maybe it's through the Greens or just any body that embodies these principles. The question then becomes, how do we execute this? How do we fulfill these goals? Do we simply drop all of the commodities and practices we have become accustomed to and begin to live the basic life that the political principles outlined and proceed based on the idea that the people will, by their own volition, follow these principles with no selfish attitudes that will interrupt the process? This option seems quite unlikely, especially based on one of the Greens' principles that doesn't rule out power structures entirely, as it calls for people to have local power while advancing international integration. Thus, the more feasible option here is through a centralized government, it seems, where there is a strong mandate to enforce this ecological way of living. Since today we are living with governments that have centralized in the way that they have authority over the people, it seems like how we are today is not fulfilling the goals of conserving our resources and preserving our planet. Therefore, a more authoritarian government would have a better capacity to enforce ecological protectionist laws. This, of course, opens the door to abuse of power. What the government executes will therefore be undisputable because it is working for the ecological protectionism we elected them to implement, with no ifs, ands, or buts. This can then resemble a totalitarian society for the sake of ecological protection because the environment is affected by nearly every aspect of society, i.e. the shoes I wear, which were most likely made in a polluting factory, which would probably have a better chance of completing these actions, the totalitarian system, because it has order and thus can achieve a purpose that is quite as big as preserving the environment, especially at a global scale. Of course, this will come at the cost of freedoms and rights, but it would be justified for the goal of preserving the environment. But this is all theoretical and seems to be based on what human history I feel has reflected as the most realistic method of achieving this goal. Which brings me to my second lens to look at the plans that ecological protectionist political bodies opt for. And that is, in a way, aren't we doing this already? What it sounds like the political ecological bodies are aiming to achieve is to redo our society with concern for the environment. And thus, why I said either totalitarianism seems like the most likely option to fully achieve these goals. Since, of course, totalitarianism sounds extremely ridiculous and has its implied adverse effects, then maybe most people would prefer to follow the middle road approach, which would essentially mean backing the model we currently have. A government that cares and implements laws to protect the environment, but isn't too extreme and still regards humans' concerns, including selfish tendencies that aren't entirely overridden by environmental protection. Additionally, there always comes the risk of not executing these laws properly for non-environmental goals, and thus we would probably find ourselves in this current situation in how governments handle environmental policy. Every now and then they will reprimand a group or an organization for not following policies, but overall they don't really seem to have the environment as their number one concern. I don't aim to dismiss the Greens or any ecological preservationist political standpoint, but given what I see as how in human history our practical world functions, the revolutionary points of giving power to local authorities while advancing international cooperation just sounds convoluted and based on theory alone, which I then come to the conclusion, perhaps these principles go beyond politics and government structure, and instead needs to be implemented at an individual level in order to generate effective eco-friendly actions. Thus, in that way, perhaps the Greens and other environmentally conscious parties need to be observed not entirely on the practicality of getting into government and enacting laws, but more in terms of its membership of the people who adhere to these principles, and how we can make more people adhere to this advanced philosophy of governance from a personal standpoint that government could never enforce effectively. My other point is on the growing multipolar political thinking in the UK especially, and how it is challenging the conventional order of democratic politics. This chapter showed that there is a growing multipolar apparatus in domestic politics, and is quite similar to what we are seeing across other democratic nations like the United States. I will use the term multipolar apparatus to refer to the multiple centers of political thought that influence government and national power. So, the diversity of political thoughts has obviously always been a thing in politics, even in the two-party system of the UK and the United States. But what is unique about today is the scale and leverage of technology to attract citizens, which are the building blocks of any democracy, towards more diverse political thinking. We are seeing over time that the ideas we once considered fringe and not influential in national politics are already making their marks in national politics, i.e. Brexit, that 20 years ago, before the referendum vote, was a comparatively minor voice in UK politics. What this seems to show, alongside the growing irritation with the two-party system, is that in countries like the United Kingdom, politics is no longer a simple Labour v Conservative debate where only their respective politics have considerable clout alone, because Brexit is one example of how an idea outside of the two-party system succeeded and has reshaped British politics, and at such a rapid pace. This isn't to say that the two-party system will eventually die from this, because what it seems like the two major parties are trying to do is reorganize themselves to attract the followers of fringe politics. The reorientation efforts, like the two major parties, are showing that multipolar politics are grabbing the attention of the big established parties of left and right. And in this way can be seen as a win for multipolar politics in transforming the national dialogue, even if it is within the two-party structure. This then proposes the question, why does it seem that it is happening now so rapidly, i.e. the appeal of further right political rhetoric about enhanced immigration control? This seems to be in part from the massive capacity of technology to rapidly share information and connect people of like-minded politics at a faster and more efficient rate than has ever been seen before. This is speeding up political thinking, protest movements, and community building that can even go across national borders. Additionally, this technology is so democratic that it can virtually give every person a seat at the table on nearly every political concept, i.e. the ability Facebook groups had in showing and uniting Trump supporters for the January 6th riot in 2021. What we are seeing is that the former big challenge that fringe politics had in gaining political traction, which required time and patience for others to adopt their policies, has been fast-tracked like never before, where conspiracy theories that would have taken years to have been taken seriously now have become a significant feature in governance, i.e. QAnon in the United States. We are seeing concrete examples of this already in development. For example, in the United States, the anti-vax movement was no politically influential movement by the end of the 20th century, but the current Trump administration has someone from this branch of scientific thinking as head of the Department of Health and Human Services. We can't deny that the diversity of political thinking has gone beyond the traditional two-party system of politics. And these fringe ideas, which are still finding their footing in the political spectrums from various countries of left and right and have seen instances of overlap, are becoming legitimate political concerns for both the citizenry and our politicians. Although the US and the UK are two divergent examples of a multipolar apparatus of politics that has made national political headway in recent years, they both share overlapping themes in regards to the rise of third-way politics that doesn't play by the rules of the two major parties in their respective countries. And rather than remain fringe, these politics have instead been shifting the national dialogue to discuss themes that for many were almost inconceivable ideas in the not-so-distant past. This leaves me with the personal concern, which is, if this has only been what we have seen with the internet, social media, and only recently generative AI, what will we see in 10 years in regards to the political implications and effects of this rapid yet democratic technology? Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.